Host, and today my guest is Alex Moore. He's the high performance manager of the Illawarra Hawks in the NBL, and he has over 20 years of experience in elite sport, bringing a background in both strength and conditioning and in exercise physiology. Prior to the Hawks, he was the head and strength and power coach at the North Melbourne Football Club and the Brisbane Lions. He's also worked in America as a high performance manager of the Cleveland Cavaliers and a strength and conditioning coordinator in the US ski team. So his key topic today will be on the demands of working as a strength and conditioning coach in the NBA. Really looking forward to this topic. It's not something we've discussed at this stage yet in the podcast. So for those strength and conditioning coaches out there listening in, make sure to get the notebook out as we'll have some fresh content for you all. Before we start this episode, for those tuning in live and maybe new to the podcast, our mission here is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show your support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Welcome, Alex. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
Thanks, Jack. Glad I know we've been trying to connect for a little bit, but glad it's finally happened, and happy to have a chat and talk about my experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to it. You've been recommended highly. And like you said, we've had a bit of back and forth, but persistence pays. I'm a big believer of that. And I reckon this will be one of the best episodes yet. So we'll
no pressure.
Try to do it. No pressure.
Yeah.
Take us back to the beginning, mate. At what age did you discover you had a passion for elite sport and strength and conditioning?
Yeah, I think probably like most strength and conditioning coaches, I played every sport under the sun and wanted to be a professional and probably wasn't good enough to do it. And then, I came through in the 90s, through university in the 90s, and there wasn't too many positions. Most of the strength and conditioning coaches when I came through were PE teachers. Mm-hmm. So playing, sport through school, I took 1 year off to do a gap year in England, and I came back and decided I want to be a PE teacher because I wanted to be around sport. And then I was really lucky. My second year of university, I did a prac at the Sydney Swans because Aaron Murphy, my supervisor at UTS at the time, was working there, and he got me a prac in there, and I got in there and said, "This is it. This is what I want to do." So from then on, I just had a laser focus on doing everything I could to get into that industry. And at the time, there was only pretty much one full-time person in high performance at every club, and then there was a secondary person that would come in and do strength or help with the rehab. And so that's how I started out, and was lucky enough to get in early. As the industry, I kind of was part of it when it was semi-professional, and seen it go full professional since then.
Yeah, the phys eds, I was told they were called back then.
Yeah, exactly right. That was how they were classed at that point, and it was actually true because everybody, there was no pathway for sports science, really early days. So most of them were PE teachers that had an inkling for sport and fitness, and then went across.
Yeah. And you mentioned you played a lot of different sports and the inkling to travel and have a gap year. What inspired you in terms of PE and working in sport while you're over in England? Was it a particular practitioner, or was it something that you spent a day down at a club? Or take us through, I guess, for those that aren't sure what they want to do.
I was lucky. I went over to play cricket in Hertfordshire, which is a small county outside of London, and I got a job at a school and the PE teacher had left. So I basically just filled in as the PE teacher, unqualified at that point, but just helping out. And I just played sport 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day with the kids. And I thought that was what I wanted to do at that point. So that was the dream. So I wanted to play PE because I just wanted to play sport the rest of my life. So that was kind of why I wanted to do it at university.
Yeah. And how did you reach out to Aaron Murphy? Was that email, letter?
So he was one of my lecturers. And then I remember at a lecture he had mentioned that he was looking for students to go and do. We had to do, I think it was 180 hours at that point, a practical. And I jumped at it and luckily got it. And then I was, the assistant to the assistant cone picker up. For 2 years, I just ran around and set out cones, measured things and just helped out in the gym as much as I could. But it was such a great experience, just learning from really good people, and also being part of professional sport at a really young age. I was younger than most of the players at that point, so it was really cool to be part of it. And from that experience, that kind of lit the fuse for me from there. So
yeah, it's a good segue for the next part, mate. Who have been some strong influences over your career?
Yeah, I
mentors?
definitely think Aaron Murphy early, he got my start. And then from there, I've been really lucky to have some good mentors. And I think it's so important for young strength and conditioning coaches to find people that have experience and can help them. And my whole career, I've been doing it over 20 years now. The people that have mentored me are the first people I go to if I have an issue or I have a question. So Lachlan Penfold, who's down at the Melbourne Storm, he was my boss at Brisbane Lions. And he also had a year in the NBA at Golden State. So I saw him a lot over there, but he's been a terrific mentor and someone I definitely lean upon. Another one is Troy Flanagan, who's the head of high performance at the Milwaukee Bucks NBA. He's been there. They won a championship 3 years ago, and he's been there for 6 years now. And he was my boss at the US ski team. So he was the big boss, the high performance director at the US ski team, which is a massive team. They've got 220 athletes. And I was the strength and conditioning coordinator. So I was there for 6 years, and he's another one that I really look up to and talk a lot. And then finally, probably from my time at North Melbourne, just got a really good relationship with John Siegel, who's now with tennis and Coconatus and doing his thing there. So yeah, and then they're probably the people that I look up to the most in the industry and have learned the most from as well.
You mentioned earlier how important it is to have strong mentors, and it sounds like you've still got a connection with these practitioners.
Yeah.
How regularly would you touch base with them and problem solve and sort of chew the fat, so to speak?
Yeah, like probably once every 2 months, 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, wow.
It's more so when something comes up that you haven't seen, and maybe after 22 years, there's little that you haven't seen at that point. But there's definitely times when I get thrown curveballs at work, and you're like, man, what should I do with this? A lot of it now has more become for positions like vacancies, job positions. We'll contact each other. So I know a lot of the teams, like in America, NBA teams rarely advertise because we did that. My first year in Cleveland, we advertised for an assistant athletic trainer and had over 1,000 applicants. So it's impossible to wade through that. So you tend to lean on the people that you trust in the industry to give you referrals for other people or young people that they've had. So I'd say most of the time now is that I talk to these people is about, hey, we're trying to fill this position, or we're looking for somebody. Do you have any ideas? And that's why there's networks, and keeping your networks and not burning your networks as you go through your career is vital, because as soon as that happens, it's really hard to get positions, and it's hard to even be in the mix because so many jobs aren't advertised either.
Yeah. Well, if you had to put a percentage on it, in your experience, has it changed much? I guess would be one question over the last 20 years, that ratio of jobs that are advertised compared to those that are behind the scenes. And then, what would you say if there was a split?
I think look, they advertise more now than they did probably 20 years ago, probably because a lot of organizations have to, whether it's government requirements or organizational requirements. But I would still say in those, the NBA, for instance, I would say at least 75% of the jobs go unadvertised, and they have people in mind, and that's how they find it.
And for those that are studying high performance sport and have yet to go through the interview process for a full-time role, but it's something they're working towards, what would be a typical approach? You've worked it across a range of different elite sports over different countries. What would you say is sort of the standard process?
It's a tough one because it's the old adage that a lot of people miss out because they don't have experience, but then don't have the opportunity to get experience. So my advice would be that you just have to grind. You have to spend 3 to 5 years grinding and just doing a lot of volunteered position. I did the same. I worked for a club rugby team in Sydney for 3 years, unpaid, 2 nights a week, full Saturdays. And the reality is, with those types of athletes, that's where you learn the most. University is good, but you have to be on the tools, and if you're at that level, you can afford to, we all make mistakes, but you can afford to make mistakes and still get through it and learn from those mistakes. Whereas the problem is if you come into an NBA team and you make a mistake or you don't have the experience to deal with situations, you get out of the system really quickly. So I think the sad reality is there's not that many jobs. There's quite a few teams, but there's not that many jobs at each team. And so what you need to do is make sure that you're confident in your abilities, and you only get that by coaching. by being a coach, and working and trialing, and then going from there. And the other thing I would say for me, in positions where I've been, where we've tried to employ people, is there's, particularly in America, there's a lot of people that have the same resume. So, they've, in the US particularly, they've worked at a Division I school, they've done strength, and they've got a little bit of experience in something else, in some other area. But what we tried to do is find someone that had a skill set outside that made them stand up, whether that's a secondary degree in nutrition or an interest in physiology, or whatever that interest may be. But if it's just strength training, you're going to find it hard early to get jobs, because there's so many people that can do that. So it's having experience in other areas, or having an interest in other areas that you can talk to and promote yourself as.
Yeah, it's great advice. For those that haven't quite built that second tier, or that extra string to their bow, would you recommend going with what you're most passionate about, what lights you up, or is it more looking at where the industry's going, maybe data analytics, or, things where there is a high demand?
Yeah, I think to be true to yourself, and if you're going to be good at what you do, I think you have to push what your passion is. I don't think, if your passion strength training and it's not looking at GPS numbers, I wouldn't go into an interview promoting that's what you want to do. Sure, take an interest in that and know that, but ultimately, I don't think then, if you got placed in a job where you're just looking at GPS numbers and weren't able to do any strength, I don't think that's probably the pathway you do. So I think go with what your passion is, but get as much experience in other areas outside of your specificity, to give yourself the best chance to get those positions.
Yep. And tapping into your mindset, early days, were you eager to throw yourself in all these different environments, or was it something that sort of happened organically, the fact that you worked across different sports?
Yeah, I think I was just really lucky. My first job was at the Sydney Academy of Sport, which was I had Waratahs rugby for 6 months of the year, and I had the Australian ski team for 6 months of the year. So I had this mix of, and I'd worked in rugby and played rugby, but I'd never worked in skiing. So I had this opportunity where, my first day with the Australian ski team, I was trying to ski down the hill and had no idea what I was doing, and everybody was laughing at me. But it's you grow from those opportunities, and now, I've had 15 years almost in professional skiing. So now I'm kind of the strength and conditioning expert that people go to. So you have to understand that everybody starts somewhere, and it's just getting that experience. But I've been super lucky. I've done, basketball, cricket, rugby, AFL, a whole bunch of individual sport athletes. So I think you can learn a lot from different sports, and I think people can get pigeonholed. They just want to stay in AFL, or they just want to stay in rugby, and they don't see what happens outside of that, because some of the stuff that happens in basketball is really interesting and really different to the way they run things in AFL. For instance, in basketball, pretty much every team around the world does weights before they do training. And that's in AFL, that would absolutely not fly. So, but the players have always done it. The coaches like it because it gets them activated, and that's the way it's done, and that's the way it works. But you go into the AFL environment, and you'd be very hard pressed trying to find people do weights before, particularly leg weights before they run. And I realize the running demands are quite high, but basketball, there's pretty good demands, particularly from an agility perspective.
Yeah, and I guess if you compared it from some of the training sessions volume-wise, compared to NBA, like sometimes they would almost marry up if it's a lighter session for football. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one is you're dealing with athletes that are 7'1", 135 kilos on a hard court, and they may be running 5 to 6 kilometers a game, but there's a lot of impact, and there's a lot of changes of direction and decelerations and a lot of like I said, a lot of jumping on a hard court. So the thing with those guys is trying to make sure that rather than volume of high speed running, it's more changes of direction and impacts for those players.
And you touched on it activates them beforehand. The coaches like it. So is that something that there's a feeling there that it actually sets up for a more successful training session if they do that?
Yeah, exactly right. And even games, I was shocked when I started the NBA. A lot of the teams, the guys lift before they play. So whether it might be a bit lighter on the legs, but 2 hours before the game, there's weight rooms at the arena. Both teams will be in the weight room, and they'll be doing, they'll squat, deadlift, do a whole bunch of core and upper body. They're shorter sessions, 20 to 25 minutes, but that's before the game. And the reality with the NBA, and I know we're going to talk about this leading on from this, but the reality is you can play 110 games a year. So if you don't lift on a game day, you're essentially not going to lift, and then you run in a cycle of you lose strength, you're more chance to get injured, you get sore. So they've just adapted. You kind of adapt to what you do and what you become. So they've just adapted to doing it, and I was my first experience in the NBA. I was shocked that was happening, but then I understood it by the time I'd been in it for 4 or 5 months.
And would there be certain things that they do, whether it be out of range things like more eccentrics and things like that they do after the game or after main training? Or
it just depends. The NBA is really tough because the schedule dictates that you have to be in the city the night before your game. So, for instance, if I worked for Cleveland, if we played in Cleveland and then we had a game the next night in Miami, you don't have time to lift after the game. So you would play in Cleveland. It might be a 7:30 p.m. game. Game would finish at 10:30. Plane would leave at 1. You'd land in Miami at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and then you'd be rolling out. You'd have a team breakfast and go through the plays, and then you'd play that next night. So the reality is you kind of just have to do it, and it's not done at the intensity it is in the off and the preseason, but you'd be surprised how much lifting the guys do.
And do they, with those constraints, if those were uplifted and the players could do it, and the coaches could put in the optimal program in terms of a holistic program, do you think you'd change it, or would you keep it because the coaches like it?
I think it works pretty good. I think, like I said, they've adapted to it, and it is the best system for what the schedule dictates. It's not, from a physiology point of view, you may think that it's better done post, but there's some definitely post activation potentiation from doing it, and it's just. At least on the team I was with, it was part of the routine. Everybody did it. And there was time in between. They would go into the gym and then they would go out on the court. You can only have 2 guys on the court warming up at one time because both teams share the court. So you've only got half of the court, and you can't have 15 people shooting at the same time. It's dangerous with balls flying around. So for our team, we would only have 2 out on the court. So they just come in waves of 20 minutes over a 2-hour period. And the better players got to choose when they came, and then you fit the others around that.
Okay. Yeah, cool. And how would that on this? It's quite an interesting topic. So, how would you sort of layer if you've got a couple of games and travel and everything? When would they get their main sort of lower body hit throughout the week in season?
You try to do it. I mean, if you could, let's say. I mean, so you go through periods. You have to look at the full year schedule, and there's periods where you'll have more focus on lifting, and there's periods where you just can't. So. The worst stretch I did in Cleveland, my second year, we played 7 games in 10 nights, and we were in 6 different cities. So, and the thing with America, it's not a small country. You're jumping on, anywhere between a 1 to 5 hour flight in between games, and then it's a lot of late nights. You're getting up, you're going to bed. Sometimes you're going to bed as the sun's coming up the next day, and then the requirements are that they're playing either that day or the day after that. So, typically. We would look at the entire year, and then we'd go, okay, this is a chance. We'd put the sessions in, but you have to be so flexible in the NBA because the other thing is some of the players may be expecting to play 35 minutes and all of a sudden they're on the bench and don't play at all. So you go straight there and do it. But the answer is there's no perfect. You do the best you can with what you have. But typically we would try to get 3 to 4 25 to 30 minute lifts a week, and we'd hit upper body, core and legs on those 3 different sessions.
And would the coaches at that 7 games be rigid on we're playing our best team for the 7 games, or would you sort of periodize that?
Yeah, it depends. We were pretty lucky because we were a really good team. We had a bit more flexibility in the season to either rest guys or make sure they were getting more physical work leading into playoffs or whatever that is. We weren't scrambling to make the playoffs every year. We were always comfortably in first or second through the period I have. But for sure, there's periods where the coach is like, this series of 5 games is critical. But the NBA coaches, most of them are ex-players and are used to lifting, so they would still lift. It's just a function, because the problem is if you go 2 weeks, because if you're looking for a great spot in the schedule to lift, you'll never lift, because there are no great spots. There's just no great spots. So what you end up doing is you just modify your strength sessions based on, okay, this guy's really gassed, he's really tired, let's just back off and do a little bit less. But like I said, they're all adapted to it. They're all used to it, and at least our players were, and they're used to doing it. And you've got some that are, like any sporting team and in life, you've got some are more diligent and better at doing than others, and you've got your genetic freaks who get away with doing less and remain uninjured.
And from a programming point of view, like exercise selection with, like you said, 7-foot athletes, that schedule, would you, how did you apply a different program to, I guess, the Australian sort of traditional model in terms of like maybe box squat in season, trap bar deadlift, doing more machines or simple movements, or is it, take us through sort of
it's tough. And the other one is you're often in a hotel gym or you're in an arena gym and you don't have the equipment. So a lot of stuff's done with bands, whether it be mini bands or resistance bands, like bigger bands. But typically for the taller guys, it just depends individually. We would definitely have guys box squatting, but some guys are so tall and just can't coordinate it. It becomes a risk reward thing. And the other thing with the NBA is you only have a 3-week preseason. So, and the turnover is so high. So you might get a kid from Europe that comes in and can barely lift. And so you have, you're not going to teach a guy proficiently to squat or power clean or whatever that exercise is in that period. So you just have to get him as strong as you can with what you've got. So whether that's machine or more body weight stuff, you just have to adapt to each individual. Unlike AFL or rugby, you'll see a vast array of different exercises in an NBA team that guys are doing. You might have people doing completely different programs because they might be 34 years old and they've gone through a program or a system that they believe in, and they'll come to you on a 1-year deal. And you're not going to say, hey, you need to do my program. This is the only way to do it. Of course, you meet them halfway. You say, well, what's worked for you? I'll help you. You get that going, and I'll put my own stuff in as we go. But typically for the tall guys, modified like trap bar deadlifts, normally you go a little bit higher. It just depends on range of motion. You got to watch, obviously, with really tall guys, you got to watch. Backs are a big issue. Probably one of the biggest issues is either back spasms or bony related, stress. So you got to be careful with total loading. The other thing you got to remember is some of these guys mechanically are not amazing. We had guys with size 21 feet, or feet that are so banged up. And if you looked at any basketballer's toes, they're horrendous because they're always smashing into the front of the shoes. So you just need to be flexible. And there's no one exercise I think you can't do. You just more have to be careful on each individual and properly run your eyes over them when they're training and make sure they're doing everything with great technique.
Yeah. There's a few things you mentioned there that sort of sprang to mind in terms of like that are unique, obviously 3-week preseason, and then guys that are, how much changeover there is in the list. And there's that, you hear about how everyone has their own team of support staff over there. So how would you manage that as a manager in terms of if they've got their own guy, like you said, meeting them halfway? But would you ever have like their own personal trainer in sessions while the group's training, or is that always done behind the scenes?
No, well, it depends on the team. Some teams do. And it's really up to the management of the team whether they do that. I mean, we had big name players, and we had some of them had their own strength coaches, but they were employed by the organisation, so they were part of the organisation.
Oh, right.
So I think that worked really well, and they integrated with how they've done. And if you've got a 35-year-old player who's one of the best players in the world, of course, whatever they've been doing, they should continue doing it. So you'd be naive to think you can go in and change their program and make it great. So I've heard of other teams that it's just a free for all and there's a whole bunch of different strength coaches, but we definitely didn't have that, and everyone was employed by the organization. And then in terms of getting new players, because you can get a new player, you can meet a player at the arena that someone gets traded and 2 days later another player turns up at the arena and you meet them an hour and a half before the game, and then they're playing for you. So there's very little time to, it's more, do you like Gatorade or water, and let's just go from there for the game. So And then, of course, if they've said, I've got a guy that I train with in Atlanta, and this is the method that I work, so then you go, okay, you'll talk to them, instigate that initiation, because the athlete ultimately, particularly in the NBA, they are their own business, and it's big money, and they'll do whatever they think is best for them. So you need to make sure, if you want buy-in with that athlete, you have to go through that process. And the other thing is realizing that sometimes that may be the best thing for that athlete. So you need to find that delicate balance.
Yep. And something you mentioned earlier is how often jobs are sort of successful applicants come through inner networks rather than sort of publicly advertised like in other industries. How common is it for Australians? You mentioned Lachlan Penfold that worked Golden State Warriors, obviously yourself, but how many Australian coaches have sort of worked in the NBA over the last sort of decade?
So I don't know of anyone that was in. I think I might have been one of the first in there. I started in 2013. And when I started, there was no Australians, and then 4 or 5 years later, there was a ton. But a lot of them came through the networks of the first person over there. So Troy at Milwaukee, they've had a lot of Australians through there. Troy was at the US ski team. And a lot of his staff have come from the US ski team, and a lot of the staff that we had at the US ski team have ended up at different teams. So now, I mean, I don't keep track of it, but I would say probably a third of the teams have at least one Australian on staff, whether it be in the medical and physio or strength and conditioning. But it definitely wasn't like that when I started, but it proliferated very quickly. So
and that's obviously due to success. Like coaches and players are trusting more Aussies doing that type of work now.
I don't know. I mean, hopefully that's the indication. I think the NBA is a little bit of a copycat league, so I think a couple of teams do it, and then everybody else tries to copy it, and then whether that's a British person in 5 years' time, and then there's a lot of those. But I think generally Australian sports science has a really good reputation, and has a good background in making sure that athletes are treated really well and given good programs with a lot of care. And I think that's come at the same time. Some of the best coaches I've worked with are the American strength coaches, really diligent, amazing coaches. I think Australian strength and conditioning are technically very good. And I think there's a lot to learn from some of the American coaches, because whilst they may not have the scientific understanding, I think the way that they have the ability to get athletes to do things and to buy into the program is elite. And at Cleveland, our strength coach Derek Millender was unbelievable. He could work with anybody and have them, believing that this was the program. So I think that's something that the American they grow up with a real culture, coaching culture. High school coaches high schools have professional coaches, coaching football teams and professional strength coaches. So most of those sports scientists have gone through learning how to coach properly. So
yeah, sure. And then in terms of demand on a strength and conditioning coach working in the NBAs, you mentioned something that sprung out to me in terms of like 7 games in 10 days in 6 cities. There's not a lot of life outside of basketball. It sounds like with that going on, it's a real bubble. How do you manage your workload and life balance? And
it's really tough. And I'm not crying poor here. It's an amazing job. It's one of the best jobs I've ever had. It's so exciting. You're on court with some of the best athletes in the world. I loved it. I did it for 5 years, and it was, it's one of the best jobs I've ever had. But it is demanding. There is no doubt. It's once you're in it, and the scrutiny on the team, particularly Cleveland at the time. We had some of the best players in the world on the team, and a lot of pressure to win a championship, and you cannot get away from it. You turn the radio on in your car and you're listening to it, and everybody, all your neighbors know who you are and what you do, and everyone at your kid's school is the same. So, but the actual schedule is really tough. So it's an 82 game season. But if you throw in preseason games, so you can play 6 to 8 preseason games, and often they might be overseas. So you could play. We played 1 year in Brazil. You can play in China, and then once you get to the playoffs can go for 28 games. So the actual playoffs is more games than an AFL, or an NBL season. So that alone, 2 months of that pressure is a lot, and there's a lot of plane flights, and it's luxurious travel. You have, we had our own plane. You each have your bed on your plane. There's tables. It's really cool. but you do get to a point where you don't want to get on a plane because you're just traveling that much. And it just feels, I think the best way to describe the NBA travel schedule, if you're traveling with the team, it just feels like you're jet lagged the whole time. You kind of wake up in a hotel room and it takes you kind of, 30 seconds to calibrate which city you're in and what's happening that day. At the same time, really, cool opportunities. You get to travel the US and meet a lot of people that you ordinarily wouldn't. But the other thing is for us, we went to the final for 4 straight years against Golden State. And then you think just when you're ready for a break, it doesn't come because the draft is 3 days later. So all of a sudden you've got to do all these workouts for all the draft kids that are coming in. And then summer league hits you a week later and you've got to go to Vegas for 2 weeks. And then I worked with one of our players over the summer. So I just traveled wherever he went. So we'd be in LA or we'd be in the Hamptons so it is very demanding. And it was tough for me because I had 3 young kids at the time.
Wow.
And so it's a very hard thing. And part of the reason that, the reason that I left the job in the end is I couldn't maintain family life and that life. I was just missing too much of my family's life. And my final year, I was on the road for 210 nights of the year. So that included the summer, and I missed of the 5 people in my family, I missed everybody's birthday, including my own, in terms of being at home. And I missed Christmas and Thanksgiving, which is basically everything. So I just made that. I made that decision that 5 years was plenty, and it was an unbelievable experience. But it's the typical response I got. Because quite a few Australians started the years after me, and I would always tell them they would start the first season, and you'd see them in November when the season starts, and they're like, "This is amazing, this is awesome." And I said, "Come talk to me in February," and you'd see these strength coaches in February just so tired and so jet lagged, and they're like, "Oh man, there's 30 games to go," and I'm like, "Yeah, you'll be all right. You just got to get used to it." So, and you need the biggest trait I could say for someone working in the NBA or working in a sport that has that demands is you have to have a personality that is durable and is consistent. You can't be up and down. It just doesn't fly in those. You've got a small crew of people, and you need people that emotionally can stay consistent. The highs aren't too high and the lows aren't too low. And then you also just have to be durable. You just have to grind your way through it. And at the same time, I sound like I'm complaining. It's an unreal opportunity and it's an amazing experience. But you just have to be willing to make those sacrifices.
100%. No, thanks for providing an insight. It's a unique experience, and certainly no doubt there'll be a few S&Cs listening in, or physios that aspire to do it. So to be able to hear firsthand how it is, you can probably appreciate how maybe someone that's going through the grind now, that work capacity is hopefully going to transfer into the top level. It doesn't stop when you get there. It goes to another level.
It does. Yeah, if you get to that level, your phone's on all night long. Let me tell you, you get a lot of 3 a.m. calls from coaches or medical staff. So,
but for the athletes listening in, developing athletes, what did you learn from the world class athletes that you worked with at the top level in terms of their mindset and work rate, work ethic?
Yeah, I think. Look, I was lucky. We had some unbelievable athletes. I think the biggest thing I took away from the great NBA players is they just love the game. They absolutely love basketball, and it's crazy. You'll see as much basketball as you play, you'll get on a bus after a game, and they'll be watching other games, and they're just so passionate about that particular game. And I think to really be the difference between the good player and the amazing player is they just fall in love with the sport, whatever that sport is. And that's something I've seen in every sport that I've worked with. And the other thing that I think the really great athletes have to fall in love with training as well, because the reality is to get great, you have to embrace strength training and conditioning training, and you have to be passionate about that. So amongst the really amazing athletes that I've been lucky enough to work with across a range of different sports over the years, I could barely think of any that just don't love training and are really consistent with their training, not just their sport, but the physical training, because you can't get away with it. You don't build durability unless you spend time in the weight room and conditioning and on your body and spending money, whether that's getting massage or anything else. So, yeah.
And you mentioned as well, like one of the athletes you traveled with, obviously you built a strong relationship with that player. And you were one of the first, if not the Aussies that were in this sort of caper. How did you go
Yeah.
about building buy-in when I imagine early on they would have been judging you and working out who is this Aussie guy and, sussing
Yeah,
out?
100%. I think regardless of the level, whether you're a club football team or in the NBA or in the Premier League soccer, is you have to care about the athlete and genuinely care about that athlete. And they know whether you do or not. They know whether you're there, to be part of the show or whether you genuinely want them to get better. And I think that only comes through spending time, building that relationship, and doing everything you can to make them better and listening to them as well. I think often we think we know everything, and an athlete's trying to tell you something and you keep interrupting them. I think often you just need to hear them out. And then, who am I to say that what the best in the world in another sport is doing is wrong? I mean, I don't think just because I have a background in strength and conditioning doesn't mean that I know everything. And in our industry, it's a young industry. Professional strength and conditioning in Australia is barely 20, 25 years old. So, and I could think of multiple things I've done, even 5 years ago that I wouldn't do now, because the science evolves and we go, man, maybe we shouldn't have done it like that. But you make the best decisions of what you have at the time. But I think ultimately it's building trust and building those relationships, and you have to be a good person. That's the ultimate thing. If you're going to spend a lot of time with a person, like I was with Cleveland, I lived with this player and his girlfriend. It's you have to be a good human being and also fun to be around. And I think also athletes want people that are level and also really excited to train, because if I'm doing a training session, I want the person that's training me to be really pumped and excited to do it, rather than coming in and being a bit flat. So
yeah, absolutely. Well said, mate. And from the flip side, for injury is obviously not a place where athletes want to be. They want to be playing their sport. What do you believe are important skills for strength and conditioning coaches or physiotherapists in a rehab role working with long-term injury?
Yeah, I think the best piece of advice I ever got was from Bill Knowles, who's an athletic trainer. He does a lot of the ACLs, a lot of the AFL and rugby league players have gone out to see him, and he told me, because he'd worked with one of the skiers that I worked in the US. He said the most important thing in rehab is to get them to bed tired, and that resonated with me, because too often, someone comes in and they've hurt themselves, and the reality is, for a professional athlete, that's what their career is. That's what they're passionate about. That's what they want to do. That's where their money comes from. And all of a sudden that's in jeopardy, or that's taken away from them. And it can be a pretty lonely and dark place. Even if you're on a team, because it's sometimes in a team, it's even worse, because you see everyone doing what you want to do and you're not able to do it. So I think the thing that Bill really stressed is that, like, just because you've got a hamstring injury, you can still train. You can still do things. So I think we don't often in rehab do enough training. Obviously working around the site and making sure the conditioning's done. So, and his whole adage of getting to bed tired is like, there's no reason they should come in and just spend 30 minutes on a physio table and spin the bike for 30. There's so much more they can be doing and getting better at. So everyone that I've rehabbed, we've really focused on, okay, we're looking at this set time period. What are we going to get better at? It's your hamstrings, but what else are we going to improve here? And how are we going to do that? And let's come back with a level of conditioning that's you've never had before. And from that, ultimately, most athletes love training, and they love training hard. And when they're training hard and they're tired, they sleep better, they think less, and they're happy to be around. So I think what I've seen is a lot of people underdo rehab. They don't do enough work, and they don't spend enough time with them. And I totally get, if you're on a big team and you've got 45 people, it's hard to do that. But the best rehabs I've had personally with mine is the ones that I had the ability to spend 4 or 5 hours with them every day and make sure that everything we were doing was right. And then I individualized it to what that specific injury was. So.
And what about highlights, mate, over your career? Obviously, there's a fair few, but what spring to mind that you're most proud of?
Yeah, I've been lucky. You know what? I've been on really good teams and I've been on bad teams. So I think someone said to me once, the best strength coach just picks the best team. In terms of results, and because we always look at the best team and think, whoever the strength and conditioning coach there must be a genius. But often, talent talent wins out invariably. I mean, there's a few highlights in my career. I mean, definitely 2016 we won the NBA championship. That was just an unbelievable opportunity, and Cleveland had never won before.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You know, 4 days later they had a parade, and there was 1.5 million people in a city of 350,000 people for the parade. And you know, 2 months later, we got a championship ring, and we got to go to the White House, and Obama was there, and Biden was the vice president. So some of the experience I've had in that was amazing. Also, you know, when I was at US ski team and the Australian ski team, I was lucky enough to train some Olympic gold medalists. So being there at the Olympics and watching someone fulfill their dreams is fun. But as much as those, I wouldn't say that they're the most obvious ones, I think, to say that are the highlights. But I think the most satisfying ones are the people that probably nobody's ever heard of. You know, that it was the kid that did 3 ACLs and finally got back to play. You know, it was for me at North Melbourne. You know, I work with Majak Dor, working back from his accident and seeing him, you know, over this 18-month process, getting back to playing footy from some significant injuries, significant enough that early days we probably thought, you know, he wouldn't be running, let alone playing footy. And his first game back up on the Gold Coast, he kicked a goal at the end, and we ended up. The team was just it was one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. Like we were all on the bench crying. It was so magnificent because I'd seen what it had taken and how hard it was for him to work back to that. And so being there and seeing the fulfillment of him getting back on was just it was just magic. And I don't. It may sound like BS, but I wouldn't trade that for a championship, like, because that's the stuff that really makes a difference. And it's the same with the Australian ski team. I can remember in 2006, Torino, Dalberg Smith, our mogul skier, won gold medal. But we also had a young kid who got 11th. And I had as much satisfaction in him getting 11th as we did the other kid getting the gold medal, because I'd seen what it had taken him. 11th was an unbelievable result for him, and he'd skied out of his skin. But I'd seen he was coming in at 5:30 in the morning and training because he had to work full time. So I'd seen the 4 years of work that had taken to him. So often I think it's easy and glamorous to say, well, you know, Olympic gold medal, NBA championship, whatever that. But deep down, I wouldn't trade that for some of the experiences I've had just on a human level and getting people back to doing what they want to do.
And on the flip side, challenges. What are some major challenges you've faced? And
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot. I mean, definitely working in a lot of different sports, and also I've been at teams with a high turnover. Having different coaches is a challenge because you have to reinvent yourself. So being at teams where you've had a different coach, you know, every 2 years, every year, consistently over periods of time, it becomes hard because you have your philosophy and then every coach has their own philosophy, and hopefully you sit down and come up with a mutual understanding that you want to get that. But you know, over the years, I've had coaches that have very similar philosophies to me, and I have coaches that have completely different philosophies. So the challenge is to find a way to get the athletes, you know, to the top level, and that may come across different philosophies. And often with strength and conditioning, you can be in a job with a coach you love, and you have a similar philosophy, and the coach leaves, or the coach, you know, gets fired, which is inevitable in this sport. And then someone comes in with a completely different philosophy. And so you have to be a little bit of a chameleon and be able to adapt to that. And the reality is it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it just doesn't, it doesn't mesh, and either you're gone or the coach is gone. So it's just how it is. That's definitely probably, I'd say, the biggest challenge.
On that one, in America, is your contract connected to the coach? Is it, or how's it sort of?
Yeah. So in basketball, your contracts for the performance team is connected with the general manager, and then the head basketball coach is connected with the assistant coaches. So typically what happens is the general manager hires all the performance staff and the medical staff, and the coach, when a new coach comes in, they get rid of all the other coaches from the previous regime, and then the coach will bring in his own people. So, I mean, as successful as we were in Cleveland, I had 3 coaches in 5 years, and I had 3 different GMs over that period as well. And so I was just lucky that the general managers that got employed at Cleveland after the previous one had either left or been fired were internal, and they knew me and they knew our staff and wanted to keep us on. But I've seen some of the best strength and conditioning practitioners of in the world get fired just purely on circumstance. They may be there, and a general manager changes, and the new GM comes in and brings his own people and you just have to accept that that's part of the industry. Same as coaching. Coaches are the same thing. You can, and the other reality is if you're at a bad team and you don't have a lot of talent, the chances that you're going to get fired are probably higher than if you're at a team that's winning. So, because winning can hide a lot as well.
For sure. Yeah, we'll move into the get to know yourself segment, maybe the personal side. So it's a bit lighter on, but favorite inspirational quote or life motto? Do you have one?
I don't know if it's inspirational, but I think I really like don't let perfect be the enemy of good. In terms of, I think sometimes as practitioners, we spend too much time on the details and we try to get everything absolutely perfect and we miss the biggest picture. Or the bigger picture. So, we may have a strength program and you've read, it's a squat progression and you've read every Russian or German training regime and you've built in this thing and you spend so much time on it, you're not in the gym with the athlete watching them train. So I think that's just an example. Or, the classic is we get so fixated on GPS numbers and you've got 6 people huddled around a GPS screen looking at the GPS screen and you've got an athlete running across the field with a limp and nobody picks it up because we're so fixated on putting objectivity and quantification to things that we actually lose that art. So I think often the reality is even at the highest level is things go wrong and, nothing's perfect. So I think what you have to do is put the best program in you can at the time and realize that we should strive for perfection, but it's absolutely unachievable in professional sport. And so you have to be okay sometimes with okay and good instead of, trying to run this regime and maybe just missing the big picture, maybe missing the whole idea of what the training process is about.
Yeah, it's something that seems to be consistent all the way through how important it is to be adaptable that you found over your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
What about in your work life? Do you have pet peeves? Anything that makes you angry?
Nothing. I'm too old to get angry, but I think when athletes and strength and conditioning coaches just get away, jump on an idea. So over my career, I've seen so many different. We've had CrossFit, we've had polarized training, we've had sweet spot training, we've had so many different variations of training. I think everyone's always looking for the latest and greatest. And that's coaches, and I've been guilty of that before. That's coaches as well as athletes. But I think if you're always jumping from one training philosophy to the next training philosophy, you end up not really building anything. And I think the reality is the really successful training, and you look at the really good athletes, often their training is pretty simple, but they do it really well. So they spend a lot of time doing conditioning and they do the basic strength exercises and they build it from there. Whereas sometimes, you'll have 19-year-old kids that haven't been training for very long and they're looking for some amazing training methodology that they've seen an NFL player doing, and that's the way to go. Whereas they're actually missing, the whole point of training and just keeping it simple. And the best programs I've seen are quite basic.
And what about your favorite way to spend a day off when you get one?
Yeah, I think I definitely, with as much travel as I've done, it's nice. I'm originally from Wollongong, so I was really fortunate that I could find a job. There's only team the Dragons in rugby league and the Hawks in basketball, the only teams here. So I think being home after essentially being on the road for 20 years is really nice. So I think on my day off, I'd like to be home in my home gym, probably lifting and then watching the kids play sport.
And favorite holiday destination?
Well, I've got a few. I mean, probably Wollongong at the moment, just because it's a beautiful spot. But I think it's definitely going to be sports centric. If you could find me a spot where I could ski in the morning, ride my bike at lunchtime, and then go to the gym in the evening, and the whole time in between that, spend it at the beach. That would be my ideal location. So I don't think. Well, I know that doesn't exist, but yeah, generally somewhere has been active. I think if I had to pick a spot, I'd say Northern Italy, where I could ride my bike and ski as well. So
yeah, there'll be a world at some point where that will be possible.
Hopefully, yeah, it might be virtual. So
yeah, that could be a whole new podcast.
Yes, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for jumping on, Alex, and sharing with us your stories. And I'm a big believer that success leaves clues. So, and you've definitely left a fair few out there for us, not only for coaches that want to work in elite sport, but also for athletes. What are you excited about for 2022? You've mentioned it's been 20 years since you've been back home.
Yeah.
That'd be exciting.
I think it's being back home. I think also we're fortunate. Next week the road. I'm a big cyclist. Like I like cycling. I'm the wrong size for it, but we got the World Championships in Wollongong next week. So I'm super excited. We have to go to Darwin for a preseason tournament, but we make it back for the women's and the men's race the following weekend. So I'm super excited for that. And they ride right by our house, so we can just sit out the front yard and watch them go. So yeah, really excited about that.
Awesome, man. I know you've mentioned off air you're not a social media man, but if anyone wants to hit you up for a question or something that you've tickled their fancy over the listening to the podcast, is there a way that they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, they can't find me, which is the way I want it to be. So I tend to be a ghost. Yeah, I resisted. Maybe I've been fortunate enough that I got in the industry before social media, so I've built enough contacts. But no, I don't have any social media at all. So probably the best way, they could reach out to the Illawarra Hawks, and then they could find me that way. But I tend to try to fly under the radar as much as I can.
Yeah, very good, mate. Well, yeah, thank you so much for jumping on. And for those that have tuned in live as well, make sure to watch the whole recording. As soon as we finish this live show, the recording will be on our YouTube, and we'll post it on our podcast next Wednesday. Our next live chat is with Jasper Fletcher. He's a Brisbane Lions father and son prospect for the 2022 draft, and that will be on Tuesday at 4 p.m. So I'll see you guys then. Thanks again, Alex.